easy. Well, thank you all. That helps me too. So Nadia asked me to talk a little bit about soil health, and when we're done here, we'll go out and Dr. Guy has a few things to show you out in the pasture about plant physiology too, but spending just a little bit of time talking about plant health. And in your slides there's a slide that I borrowed from Dr. Guy talking about health, and the idea with health is that it's not just the absence of disease or sickness. Health is like a vibrant state of being where you're full of life and you're actively pursuing, your body's functions are actively pursuing healthy pursuits, and it's the same thing in plants and it's the same thing in soils. So when we talk about soil health, we're talking about how those various domains of the soil, the physical, the chemical, and the biological, are all functioning on their own and interdependently with one another to provide the environment for the whole system. And so there's, within those three different domains, there's a lot of things we could talk about, way more than what we've got time for right now. But with the physical things, there's a list of some of the physical characteristics of soils on your slide there. This isn't comprehensive, but we've got things like texture, the amount of sand, silt, and clay; structure, how those individual particles of soil are aggregated together; porosity, which is also related to aggregation or structure; color, the organic matter content, the degree that water will infiltrate a soil and be able to be absorbed by the soil, but also the excess water can pass through the soil; the amount of water that the soil can hold for plants to be able to use; and then the bearing strength, or how well, we could think of it for the terms of what we're doing here, how well can the soil support a tractor going across it or a cow standing on it, walking across it, feeding itself. I'm just gonna get him off of here because I think he's got better things to do, really. He or she, I can never remember which one is which. So from the standpoint of those physical characteristics of the soil, there are some things that are just inherent to the soil that we can't change. We're not going to affect the amount of sand, silt, and clay that are in the soil. We might be able to affect something like the color of the soil, but really there's only a handful of things that are physical characteristics of the soil that are predetermined that we don't have some influence over. And I'd like to talk a little bit here about the importance of structure or aggregation, because this is something that our management does directly affect, and it's something that if we understand what causes structure to form and deform, there's things that we can do in our farming practices and our grazing practices that can either improve that or deteriorate it. And so again, when we talk about structure, what we're talking about is bringing those individual particles of sand, silt, and clay, and particles of organic matter into discrete little packages in the soil. And when we do that, there's some neat things that come with that. By virtue of having those all together in a little package, or what we call an aggregate, those individual particles of sand, silt, and clay, and the organic matter, the nutrients, the moisture, and all those things that are good aspects of the soil are now in a little sort of a piggy bank. And so they're protected. And as long as that aggregate stays intact, they're not going to wash away, they're not going to leach away, they're not going to get oxidized, they're going to be protected. And yet, while they're inside that package, plant roots can get to those, the microbial community in the soil can get to those and use all those things that are beneficial, and it's a really nice system. Coming along with the structure then, that also implies that around each one of those aggregates we've got some kind of a void, a pore, a space, a channel, something like that. And so what we find is that the more well aggregated that a soil is, the more porosity it has also. And that porosity is very important because that's what allows water to infiltrate down into the soil when we get a rainfall. Instead of just hitting the ground and running off, where it's going to go into some surface water and not do us any good in our farming system, we want that water to go into the ground. And once it's in the ground, we want it to absorb into those aggregates so that each one of those is holding as much water as is physically possible. And then if there's more water available to the system because of an intense rain or something like that, we'd like the excess water to be able to drain away, to percolate down through the soil. And so structure is what governs all that. The more structure we have, the better aggregated the soil is, the more all these things can work. And by the way, when that rainfall enters the soil, it's also going to draw water down, it's also going to draw air down behind it. So this is what's allowing the soil to breathe. It's bringing fresh oxygen into the soil, and it's allowing the carbon dioxide that's in the soil to escape. Because we have to remember that most of what happens underground is an aerobic process. Even though we think of plants being photosynthetic and using carbon dioxide and breathing out oxygen, what happens underground, even with the plant roots themselves are aerobic. They're going to be breathing in oxygen, and they're going to be releasing carbon dioxide along with all these other organisms that are in there. And developing structure is a biological process. There are some parts of structure that can be formed by physical processes like freezing and thawing, but when we think about building really well-defined, well-structured, and stable aggregates in the soil, that's a biological process, and it's driven by lots and lots of fibrous plant roots and all the microbial activity that's going on in what we call the rhizosphere, that area right immediately surrounding each of the roots, and all the organisms that are taking part in that process, particularly the fungi. So also things like earthworms, ants and termites in some areas, like where I live, ants and termites might be more important. But up here, earthworms are very, very important, and everywhere. Fungal activity is a real strong driver of starting aggregation. And so we'd like to do things that will encourage aggregation. So, when we have a really dense stand of plants growing on a particular area of soil, we've also seen lots of root activity going along with those plants. And so that starts the process of getting this aggregation going good. And the longer that system is left undisturbed, the more of the exudates from the plants and the more of the exudates from the mycorrhizal fungi and the different organisms that are living in the soil will be there to be able to bond these aggregates together and keep them stable. And the more stable the aggregates are, the more they'll be able to resist deformation from cows walking across it, from tractors going across it, from things like that, from rainfall events and all that. So we'd like to protect structure. We'd like to build structure as much as we can, and once we've got it, we'd like to protect it. And when we get out into the pasture, we'll dig a few holes and we'll take a look at structure and see what we've got to work with. So I listed a few of the practices that contribute to forming structure and stabilizing it, and there's also a slide there that talks about practices that harm structure. So anytime that we do tillage of any sort, and I know moldboard plows have a bad name, but actually moldboard plows might not be the worst thing when it comes to destroying structure. There's things that are a lot worse than a moldboard plow. But any type of tillage that we do, whether it's a moldboard plow, a chisel plow, a disc, a harrow, a rotavator, it doesn't matter. Anything that we do when we till is going to destroy some structure. So when we destroy structure, now instead of having that piggy bank intact, now we've opened it up. And all the contents of that wonderful little savings account now can be lost through one of those other mechanisms. So tillage, and by the way, forming structure and maintaining structure is a process that you don't just do once and it stays that way then, okay? These aggregates are continually forming and falling apart, forming and falling apart. And so in order for us to have a well-aggregated structure, a well-structured soil, we have to have a continuous activity going on that's forming structure and that's bonding the aggregates together to keep them going and keep that soil healthy. So that means we have to have a continual supply of living plants. We have to have a dense sward out in our pastures, and it helps if we've got a variety of different plants. Some grasses, some legumes, some broadleaves, some tall growing plants, some short growing plants, some tap-rooted plants, some fibrous rooted plants, some annuals, some perennials. All these things have a role to play, because when we think about what's going on underground, we think about things like nutrient transfer, nutrient dynamics, structure forming, all these things that are going on there. A lot of that is driven exclusively in that area of the rhizosphere by these microbes that are living there in association with the plant roots. And plants are not designed to live on their own independently. I mean, you can raise a plant hydroponically and you can get a healthy plant, but that means you have to do everything for the plant that it needs. Whereas in a system like what we're working with here with these pastures, most of those functions that a plant needs to have a good quality, high yielding, healthy plant can be taken care of by the biology in the soil. But every different plant has its own suite of organisms that it's designed to live with. And so every plant is putting out through its root system different types of organic compounds that are meant to favor that specific microbial community that will help that plant to do well. So the community that might help a bluegrass plant to do its best is going to be different than what helps a red clover to do its best. That's going to be different than a dandelion. That's going to be different than corn. And so the more different types of plants that we have growing in a small area, the more of this activity that we have going on, and the healthier the system is likely to be. So we have to have a continual supply of fresh organic matter, which means a continual supply of living plants providing continual food to this whole system. And then there's things like tillage and excessive chemical use and other things like that that can be a problem too. But when it comes to different types of farming systems that have livestock, and particularly dairy farms, it's the easiest. It's the easiest to have good quality soil because we've got all the components that we need to keep things going. So there's a lot more that we could say about that, but we've got a little bit of time here. I wanted to talk too about these other two realms of the soil. There's the chemical, and we do have to be concerned about fertility. I know a lot of you are working in soil quality, soil health areas with NRCS or other organizations, and it's terrific to see the interest in that, and the things that we're learning in that field are just amazing. And I know that there is a contingent of people that feel that all we have to do is raise cover crops and then the world will be a wonderful place. And I'm not quite convinced of that yet. You know, cover crops are a wonderful thing and they can do amazing things. And even though we don't know as much as we need to know, or that we will find out about how things like cover crops can contribute to fertility, you still have to have some basic fertility conditions that are met. Dr. Brink talked about some of the things with alfalfa. You know, it's a queen. Yeah, it has high maintenance needs and so forth like that. But any kind of a plant, if you don't have the minimum conditions that it needs for it to grow from the standpoint of fertility or pH, it's just not going to do well. So it's still important, and I won't talk about all the specifics on that. I'm going to skip over most of this, but those 17 essential elements and the handful of what we call beneficial nutrients are still very important, and they're important not just to the plants, because we do want to have healthy plants in our soils, but we also want to have a healthy soil biology, and ultimately we want to have healthy livestock, and the food that we're producing in our systems is going to feed people. So we want to have healthy food for healthy people. So how are we doing on time, Nadia?
I think maybe 10 more minutes.
Okay.
And then we'll have questions.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. So I wanted to touch on biology a little bit there. There's that picture. I think everybody's probably familiar with that soil food web diagram. And it does a pretty good job. There's a few more arrows that should be in there going different directions, and a couple other classes of organisms that we could put in there. But it gives us a pretty good idea about what's going on and how so many different things in the soil are interrelated. But again, we know that there are just an amazing number of organisms in the soil, and we really don't know how many, because we've only been able to culture, depends on who you talk to about this, something between 1% and 1/10 of 1% of the organisms that live in the soil. We've been able to actually culture and grow so that we can study those in a lab. The rest of those, we know that they're out there through tools like PFLA or direct microscopy or things like that we can see that there's something going on there, but they don't grow in a lab. They don't grow on an agar plate because they need different conditions. So we do know that the more plant life that we have, and the healthier that it is, the denser it is, and the more diversity it is, the more of this mix that we're going to have. And the other thing that seems to hold true is that the good guys far outnumber the bad guys. So the more of it that we have, the more we have of everybody, but the more good guys we have, the better able they're going to be to keep the bad guys at bay. That's a simple way to talk about it because I'm a simple guy and I function best that way. So with regard to that, I wanted to just mention a couple of things about organic matter. Everybody believes that organic matter is good, correct? We want to have lots of organic matter, and I believe that. But we want to keep in mind that there's different types of organic matter. There's the type of organic matter that we think about that gives soils its dark color, and it's a part of the system that's that's protected in these aggregates. It contributes to soil fertility. It holds on to water. Its dark color helps the soil warm up quicker when the soil is exposed. That type of organic matter, that humus, is stuff that started off as fresh organic matter and it's been completely decomposed, and there's skeletons of microbes in there and the byproducts of their digestion processes and stuff like that. And that type of organic matter is wonderful, and we want to have a lot of that. The more the better. But that's not food for soil biology. Okay, it was food at one time, but not anymore. We still want to have it, and it's still important. But from a soil health standpoint, a lot of what we're talking about when we think about organic matter is that fresh organic matter. The stuff, either plants that are still alive right now, or the exudates that they're putting out into the soil, or the fairly recently dead residue from the plants that were growing out there, along with manure and compost and maybe cover crops and things like that that we can put out there too. Those, the living plants and the recently dead plants or related organic material, are the food for what drives a lot of this biology in the soil. So we'd like to have a lot of that out there. And again, that means that we're never finished. That means that we're continually trying to keep a dense sward, a diverse sward, a healthy sward, and get as much of that activity going on as possible. I put a couple of slides in here that I borrowed from my friend Danielle Treadwell down at the University of Florida. She had some cool ones about roots, and showing, there's one there that shows the diversity of rooting structures and so forth, and I think you're probably familiar with those. But that slide about the root activity on a single winter rye plant was just amazing. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that, but sometime when you've got a few minutes, just look over that and see. I mean, it's incredible. On one winter rye plant, 2,500 square feet of root surface, 2 million feet of root length from a single rye plant. So, you know, just imagine all the activity that's going on in conjunction with a single plant, and then look at our pastures and see what we've going on, and it's pretty amazing. I did want to mention just a little bit about nutrient cycling and nutrient availability. You know, these transformations that are going on in the soil and the soil food web, if we think about something like as basic as bacteria, that's usually where we think of the starting point as the soil food, for the soil food web, because it's the smallest organism. They're responsible for a lot of the decomposition that goes on in soils, and they have a very high need for nitrogen. So what that means is that if you've got a system where your fertility with nitrogen, for whatever reason, is a little bit limited, and there's plant residue out there, the bacteria are going to make sure that they've got the nitrogen that they need to do their job way before the plants have a chance to get at it. So nitrogen is important. But as we go across that soil food web there, and we work our way up through what they call the trophic levels, or the feeding levels in that soil food web, what we find is that each time we go from one level to the next, there's typically a little bit less need for as high of a proportion of nitrogen as you go from one organism to the next. So the bacteria are accumulating this nitrogen, and they're hanging on to it. And then as we go through that soil food web, everything else that feeds on the bacteria and the things that feed on what fed on the bacteria, and so up the chain, are going to be releasing that nitrogen. And so it's going to be a little savings account for us there, having that bacteria there, and everything that feeds on those and going up the chain, up the web from there is going to release that nitrogen at a slower pace. It's going to be sustainable. The other organisms in the soil and the plants are going to be able to take that and make good use of it. And I wanted to mention a little bit about biological nitrogen fixation here. You know.
Yeah, no, actually, it's interesting because we just made rounds a little bit about this.
Okay.
And how he was saying that there's something like in the atmosphere that you can capture it.
Oh yeah.
And you don't have to spread fertilizer. And something about, I don't know the dollar figures, but just the amount of money you can save on fertilizer just because you captured it all. And above each acre
Yeah.
of land, there's like, I don't know how many.
Oh yeah. I wish I could remember that number too.
Yeah. Outrageous. I mean,
Yeah.
About how much you capture versus have to buy.
It is incredible. It's a mind-boggling number, and I wish I could remember it too.
Yeah.
But you know, you think about the atmosphere, it's 78% nitrogen. It's just that it doesn't do us any good. It's inert. But with biological nitrogen fixation, whether it's the rhizobia that grow in association with the legumes that are out there, or it could be free living organisms too. There's a lot of nitrogen fixing organisms that aren't associated with legumes at all. There's a class of organisms called Archaea. Has anybody heard of Archaea? Okay, I see a few heads nodding. Scientists have known about Archaea for a long time, and up until fairly recently they just thought it was another type of bacteria. And they don't typically grow very well on agar plates, and they don't behave well, you know. So nobody paid much attention to Archaea, and lo and behold, we're practically drowning in Archaea. And a lot of these Archaea are nitrogen fixers. And so as we learn more about this, and we learn more about the free living nitrogen fixers, I think there's going to be ways that we can learn to even be able to better harness what they can do and make better use of that free nitrogen that's out there. So it's a really cool thing. There's a slide on here, and it didn't probably turn out as well as I hoped it would. Looks better on PowerPoint, but if you use your imagination, looking about maybe a third of the way over from left to right, I think you can see a kind of a light green strip in that field. That was from a young farmer, a young Amish farmer, Joseph Yoder, out in the middle of Ohio, and he was showing me his farm a few years ago. And Joseph is really a good farmer, and he is observant, and he's a very good manager. And I was out there visiting his place about 6 weeks, or excuse me, I guess it was 8 weeks after he made this new establishment on a hayfield. And he noticed when he got to the end of one of the strips that his clover seed box had run out. And so he refilled it and continued on planting the rest of the field. And that strip that you see in that picture, that was from the strip that he sowed where it was only grass with no clover in it. And so on the next page, if you turn that over, you see a close-up there of 2 leaves of ryegrass. One from the strip that there was no clover in, and one from the strip from the rest of the field that had the clover growing with it. So after only 8 weeks, there was already a dramatic difference in the strip that did not have the clover as opposed to the rest of the seeding. So this biological nitrogen fixation, I mean, all of us have heard about this practically forever, but it really is amazing how quickly this kicks in and how important this is to the whole system. And I think Dr. Brink, talked about the dramatic effect that legumes have on the overall system, on soil health and so forth like that. And so when we're talking about that, or when we're talking about just plain quality by means of protein and yields and things like that, this is a huge deal. I think we're getting close to being out of time. There's a couple of slides on there about what's called developing a disease suppressive soil. I borrowed these from Dr. Lori Hoagland at Purdue, and she had a really nice presentation at the Moses Conference 2 or 3 years ago talking about this, about how soil biology actually impacts the physical health of the plants by keeping them resistant to diseases and insects and things like that. And those couple of slides there, you can go through those too when you have a few minutes. But basically, what it boils down to is that plants have an internal, we can call it an immunity system if you want, but there's a system within plants that helps them to deal with disease attacks or insect attacks or something like that, and helps them to produce compounds within their own body that will help to protect them somewhat from whatever the attack is that's going on, but also through the mycorrhizal network of fungi that connects most plants to each other. Plants can communicate these chemical signals to each other. They can also send some of these aerially by producing volatile compounds that other plants that are downwind of those can detect. And it sets up their physiology to be able to deal with these better. Now, I mean, it doesn't mean that plants are never going to suffer, but there are mechanisms there that will help them to deal with that. Usually, when there's a plant pest, whether it's a disease or insect, it has a select group of plants that are its main target. And so, if you have a diverse mix of plants that are growing in the same area, in the same pasture, for one thing, you're not going to have just a monoculture of these plants that's like a billboard, you know, to every disease and insect that's out there saying, come here, we have food for you. So that's going to help. But if you did get something in there that was going to really wreak havoc with a particular species, it's only one species and you've got a lot more. So it's another reason that having a diversity of plants out there can help. So I think we are about out of time. Sure. Sure, you bet. Yeah. Okay, Dr. Guy?
So, going back to soil structure, we talked about aggregates, we talked about porosity, and then this image of water percolating down into the soil, which is so healthy, so important, actually drawing air with it. And, you know, we all know when water pools, there's this depth in the plants, you know, there's no oxygen. My question is, how much could we eliminate the use of drain tile with good farming that would encourage porosity in the soil? How necessary is drain tile, or is it a short-circuit, short-minded human thing?
That's a really good question, and I think to answer that, I think what we have to do is think about the characteristics of that soil and what's causing it to be wet. That area that you're farming where it's just level land and wet, I'm not sure. I'm not exactly familiar with that particular situation, but we have areas in the landscape where there's a shallow water table, and we can have the most fabulous structure in the world and it's still going to have a shallow water table. There's other situations where we've got areas where there's dense glacial till underneath. And pardon? Frangipans. Yeah, and frangipans. And so a frangipan is a layer in the subsoil that's got weak cementation in it, and it's hard for roots to get through, it's hard for air to get through, it's hard for water to get through. And if we can get through that, underneath that, a lot of times things are a lot better. So if it's a frangipan and we can rely on things like night crawlers and ryegrass is an interesting plant because some of the exudates of ryegrass can start changing the characteristics of the frangipan and making inroads into it and breaking it apart. And if we could continue that process and get past the frangipan, we'd probably be able to do that by improving the structure. If we've got dense glacial till, we can probably improve the first few feet, and in some cases that can help a lot. Depends on the situation with the till and the slope of the land and things like that. If we can establish good structure down several feet and there's a little bit of slope in the land so the excess water can go laterally, that can help. We were at the Mahako farm back a while ago in, was it May, June? After we had just these horrendous rains, and they had Kevin had a couple of pits in there, and I thought, oh boy, we're going to go swimming, and they were dry. And those soils were developed in glacial till, but they had been using good farming practices and good grazing practices for so long that we didn't have any water to contend with at all, and lots of night crawlers. So I think it depends on the situation. Another question.
I've never seen this mineral interactions graph that you had in there.
You haven't?
No.
Oh.
So if you could just maybe point a thing or two out on there.
Oh yeah. The illustration in your handouts there, it's like a wheel, and it shows how different nutrients interact with one another. If I can get, well, it's too hard for me to open it up. But Mulder's, thank you. Mulder's chart. Okay, this one here. Thank you. So what it's meant to show is that there's interactions between different nutrients. So some nutrients contribute to each other as far as making them more available to a plant or more nutritious in food, things like that. And some plants are, some nutrients are antagonistic, where if you have more of one, it's going to decrease the availability of another one. And so
charge mainly, like ionic charges, or
no, I don't think it's ionic charge. Well,
it definitely is ionic charge, because the one that really easy to remember is iron. You know, you have iron water stains your sinks. Iron can be in a +2 or a +3 state. It can be in both states. Copper and zinc are +2. So if you have high iron water, you have a problem with absorption of copper and zinc. And you'll see it in cattle, in black cattle, because the enzyme that makes the melanin, that makes the black pigment, is a copper-dependent enzyme. So when you see copper start to be limited, you'll see the hair turn red on black cattle on their back. And Cheyenne Christensen taught me this years ago. If you run peroxide in water, it oxidizes all the iron from +2 to +3. Hydrogen peroxide is a very active oxidizer, so it brings it to a +3. Now your iron's not competing with your copper. He said, I noticed one day that my black cows were getting red patches. I went and my hydrogen peroxide was in.
oh, interesting.
Well, I mean, that you get a red patch. That's the one thing that's one easy to remember.
And that's a really good illustration. But I think there's more to it than just ionic charge too, because when you look at some of the relations, it just, it doesn't seem to just follow that. But that's a really good point. That chart, that Mulder's chart, is used in a lot of organic presentations, whether it's soils or nutrition or whatever. But the point with it is not that you should memorize it or know every interaction, but basically if you follow those arrows or those lines from one to another, you'll see that eventually on that whole chart, and there's a couple things that are important that are not on that chart too. But the point with that is that if you start anywhere, you can go anywhere else on that diagram. So everything is connected to everything else some way or another. And the same thing is true in our pasture systems, in our cropping systems, whatever. The plants are basically all connected to each other, even if they're not mycorrhizal plants. Even if it's a brassica and they don't form those mycorrhizal associations, there's other avenues that plants are connected to each other and connected to the other organisms that are there. So everything is supposed to work as a community. And when it has a chance to do that, things just seem to work a lot better. Other questions or observations?
You mentioned about plants not doing it all by themselves. They have to need this interaction with mycorrhizae. That's true of all of them.
Yeah.
We're all part of the community, and that's why you said livestock enhance the system, because now you have another level of complexity in the biology. And that whole thing about the bacteria is just as true about our guts and our bodies. We are more colonies of bacteria than we are living human cells by a factor of 10 to 100. We are outnumbered. A lot of these things can't be cultured in the lab, but when you look at the DNA, it's there. You don't understand it all. But the point is, everything's connected, and that's what true health is all about. It's about everything working together.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so to apply this practically to my garden, should I just clear cut what's on top at the end of the season and not rototill? Or because I'm wrecking the community every time I rototill?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question was for a garden, what should we do to keep a garden healthy? I've used this before, and I hope my dad will forgive me. I love my dad. He was a great guy. But his philosophy with gardening was get out there with a rototiller every week, because if you till, then you've got the soil nice and fluffy. And then when it rains, the rain can get in the ground. and flatten it just like a pancake, so that then as soon as it dries out, you have to go back there and do it again. You know, did you ever hear of a book called The Plowman's Folly? Plowman's Folly is a cool little book. Just a short little book. You can get it. You can download it off the internet. And it was written by a guy who was, I don't know if he's considered the father of no-till or not, but, and no-till is a whole different deal. We won't talk about that right now, but his thing was about why tillage is destructive and why we shouldn't have to till, or why we shouldn't till in a lot of cases. And that, tillage is a necessary evil for most of us, you know, but his idea was till his garden as little as he can. Just keep putting stuff on the surface and let the biology of the soil incorporate that into the ground. Keep his structure, develop the structure, you know, keep those aggregates stable, and just keep feeding that soil life. So there's people who you know, have permanent walkways in their garden, and they never plant there. Those are just to walk in and out, and then the rest of the area in between the walkways is where they garden, and they don't till those, or they use a broad fork or something like that. But there's, I'd love to talk with you more about that.
There's an old
Right.
program called Bruce Dell's Garden. All
Oh,
he did
yeah.
was drop seeds on the ground and put mulch on them.
Yeah,
That was it.
yeah,
Never tilled.
yeah. Anybody familiar with a book called The One Straw Revolution?
Yeah.
A few? That's a cool book. I mean, you got to get past about a half of it is Eastern mysticism, but the farming part of it is really cool. Because this Japanese dude, he was trained as a plant pathologist, Masanobu Fukuoka, and he was trained as a plant pathologist, and then I think he got pneumonia or something, and while he was trying to recuperate in the hospital was trying to kill him by leaving his windows open and the rain coming in and stuff like that. And anyway, he developed a system where he raised rice and barley and white clover, I believe it was, and he never tilled. He just would seed into the residue of the last crop that was there and let the mulch make sure that the seed got in contact with the soil. And I mean, it's a little bit more involved than that, but it was along those lines, you know, just, you know, try to keep the soil intact, try to minimize the amount of tillage, and let the natural system do as much as possible. Pardon? I think they were. Yeah, I think they were. And just like here, I think all of his neighbors hated him because he was doing such a great job, but people flocked from all over the world to come and hang out with him. So.
We just started Mark Kopecky reading.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, no, let's take 5 minutes and take a break, and then we're going to go out for our last parade. Thank you.
Thank you.